Thank you, Madam President and members. I knew at a very young age what I wanted to do, and that was not being an elected official. That was being a pharmacist. I knew when I was 5 years old and I was in the senator from Santa Monica's district with my grandfather who had a shoe store in the Santa Monica Mall. And I remember walking with my grandfather, Edward, to have lunch with him. And I remember seeing this boy in this very funny metal chair with wheels on it. And I said to my grandfather, I said, "Grandpa, why can't that little boy walk?" And he said, "Because he has a disease and he probably will never walk again." I said, "Well, Grandpa, why can't they just give him a pill and make him better?" He said, "Well, you know, I didn't have a chance to get an education coming into this country, and I'm hoping that we can help you go to school one day so maybe one day you can find a cure so that little boy can walk again." Ladies and gentlemen, that was my inspiration to be a pharmacist, which I've loved. I've owned and operated 6 pharmacies, 4 retail pharmacies, 2 compounding pharmacies. I was operating when we used to type the labels for prescriptions on a typewriter, if some of you know what a typewriter is. We have some youngsters here that might not know what a typewriter is. And I had one of the first pharmacy computers in the state of California in 1983 when I opened my first pharmacy in Temecula called Temecula Pharmacy. So with the advent of computer technology, instead of doing paper claims, we were able to send our claims through what is now called the internet, and I used to get paid online automatically, assess whether a patient was eligible, but we had to go through what was called a switch, a company that would direct your electronic transmission to the insurance company to assess eligibility, whether the drug was covered, whether you're giving too much of a day supply. Well, with that, these managers that you've heard my colleague from Los Angeles talk about, 150 million people are having to go through 3 PBMs to get their prescriptions filled. The PBMs got smart and said, "Hey, you know, we've got a captive audience here. We can negotiate with drug companies and work out deals and not have to report it to the insurance company that we promise we're going to save money, and we're going to certainly try to do what we can to make the copays low for the patients." And the way they did that is not commonly known because basically they operate in a black box. They basically have a monopoly. And so when I graduated pharmacy school, I wanted to be an independent pharmacist. I wanted to be able to have a Cheers bar, if you will, of customers coming in, where I knew all my customers by their names and how's Aunt Sadie doing. Well, the PBMs have certainly had a dramatic impact on independent pharmacies. I ask many of you that in your communities, how many independent pharmacies do you see still exist today? And we're seeing declining numbers of independent pharmacies because they're being taken advantage of by PBMs. So what would this bill do? Well, when you sign a contract with one of these 3 BMs, they have what's called a gag clause. You can't discuss what's in that contract with anybody. So if the copay comes up $20 for a drug, but your retail price is $4.95, you can't tell your patron it'd be easier not to use the insurance and just pay the $4.95. I know we've seen AB 2893, Mr. Nazarian's bill, that was supposed to take care of that problem, but that was amended out of the bill. My friends, it will require PBMs to disclose whether or not they have contractual agreements with pharmaceutical manufacturers. You would think that when you have different pharmacological classes of drugs for doctors to choose, it's the PBM that picks the formulary and recommends it to the insurance company, but it's not always the lowest cost drug. What happens is that they will take a drug where they work out a better deal with a manufacturer, and in many cases, sometimes they will make more money on a drug than a doctor will on a doctor visit, and certainly more than $1.25 that the pharmacy gets to make a prescription. What this bill will do is it will provide in a transparent way any of these hidden rebates that these PBMs are getting that nobody seems to know about. So you've heard that PBMs decrease the cost of health care. Well, technically they do. The problem is they're putting 90% of what they save into their pockets, and they don't save the insurance companies money, and they certainly don't save the taxpayers' money or the patients. They also have onerous abilities to come out and audit you. And I'll give you 2 examples. In one of the traditional pharmacies that I had owned,
We had doctors that wrote for an albuterol inhaler. Many of you may remember that that's what kids use when they have asthma or emphysema. It's an immediate rescue inhaler. And when the doctor usually writes for them, he'll write for 1 or 2, but usually 2 because we want to make sure the kid has one at school and the kid has one at home in case they have an allergic reaction that could be life-threatening. Well, most pharmacies are going to err and say, well, it's better than a 30-day supply, which is the limit on the insurance, but we're going to give 2 inhalers because that's appropriate. We don't want to be putting a child in jeopardy. Well, what these PBMs do is they go into these pharmacies and they go back 3 years. And for all the inhalers that you gave 2 of, they bill the pharmacy back many times in the thousands and thousands of dollars. And for these small independents, it can put them out of business. One example in a compounding pharmacy, there's a drug called domperidone. This is not a drug that is related to the champagne. This is a drug that is approved in Canada that helps women that have had a baby to lactate. And we had a contract with the federal government to provide lactating women veterans with the ability to have lactation with their children. It was on the formulary for the PBM, but the PBM say they made a mistake and they should have never had it on the formulary, and they went back 3 years and took all the money back for the drug that was taking care of these lactating women. And the pharmacist, I know who the pharmacist was, would not go back to the patients and say, listen, your insurance didn't pay me, I want the money back. But they had to eat $3,000 or $4,000 in costs. Those are called clawbacks, ladies and gentlemen. So this is a pilot project. It's going to be in the counties of Sonoma and Riverside. And it's really very simple. The Department of Managed Care is going to set the guidelines for the health plans to implement. And somebody mentioned that there's creating liability for the health plans. So you all know the health plans have liability today with the PBMs that are nothing more than a contractual extension of their services. If they're doing something illegal, which they have the ability to audit and make sure they're not doing something illegal, they are held responsible. So, my friends, it's not very common that you see a Republican come up and ask for some regulatory authority, but I'm telling you that I think it's in the best interest of our constituents, of the taxpayers, of our patients, to have transparency. We see the high cost of prescription drugs. I believe with the appropriate regulation and oversight of PBMs that they can be in the business of doing what they originally were supposed to do, and that's just be an intermediary to link you to the insurance company, and the insurance company should shop for the best deal on drugs without worrying that a middleman is getting a rebate and hijacking the lower costs that we're trying to deliver for our patients. This is really about the survival of the independent pharmacies that I think go out of their way to try to make ends meet. Believe me, the economics of owning an independent pharmacy today are much different when I started than they are today. When I was in business, we used to make a few bucks on dispensing a prescription. Today, it's literally $1.25. That includes the bottle, that includes the label, that includes the consultation, the interruption to give immunizations, to nicotine abatement therapy. Thank heavens for pharmacists that are often the first line of medical care for people that can't afford to go to a doctor. So in some of the underserved areas, we see the independent pharmacies, and we need to keep them in business. And all we're asking you to do is shed some light on the PBM businesses that have been taking advantage of pharmacists, pharmacies, and patients, and let's appropriately have transparency with what they do and what they don't do. I strongly urge your aye vote.